The day had begun as any other in the quiet provincial town. The sun was high, casting a warm glow over the small community that bustled with daily routines. In the center of town stood the grand stone bank, a place where people both rich and poor kept their savings and treasures. Mr. Lewis, the bank manager, was as punctual as always, arriving before the employees and unlocking the large oak doors with an air of authority. His reputation for rigidity was well known. He ruled the bank with an iron fist and kept every employee in line. It was on this ordinary day that an unusual visitor stepped through the bank's doors. Dressed in a modest yet unmistakable outfit of a nun, Sister Margaret had come not for charity, but for an inheritance. She approached the counter, her expression serene yet firm as she handed over documents that revealed her intentions. She had come to claim something left to her by a man few knew she was connected to, a man feared and respected in equal measure in this quiet town. The bank employees exchanged glances, whispering about the unusual sight of a pregnant nun holding documents tied to a notorious figure from the past. Mr. Lewis, taken aback by her presence and by the name on the documents, guided Sister Margaret to a private room. He examined the paperwork, astonished to find it was indeed legitimate. The legacy in question was contained in a vault untouched for nearly 2 decades. The name of the original owner sent a chill down his spine: Edmund Blackwood, a man whose reputation was carved in the annals of local history as both a philanthropist and a tyrant. Edmund had once ruled over the town's underbelly, controlling wealth and wielding influence in ways that few dared to question. Sister Margaret's journey had led her here, to a vault that contained not only gold and jewels but secrets that could reshape everything she knew about herself and her family. Mr. Lewis felt his hands tremble slightly as he held the ancient key that had been stored in the bank's records for so long. He inserted it into the vault, a heavy iron door that had withstood the weight of secrets for nearly 2 decades. As it swung open, the dim light revealed stacks of faded documents, a chest of fine jewels, and old letters. Sister Margaret watched with an impassive face, yet her heart raced. She had been warned of her father's legacy but had never fully understood the weight it bore. As she retrieved her father's belongings, memories of childhood flooded her mind. She remembered a life marked by strict rules and occasional visits from strange men who looked at her with an unsettling mixture of pity and awe. She had left that world behind when she joined the convent, or so she had thought. But her father's legacy had always followed her, lurking in the shadows. Once outside, Sister Margaret took a moment to breathe in the fresh air, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly. Her calm was short-lived, however, as she noticed a familiar face across the street, a man who had been part of her father's inner circle years ago. He had spotted her, and from his look, it was clear that he hadn't expected her return. She quickly lowered her gaze and walked toward her waiting carriage. She could not afford to be drawn back into her father's world, not now, not when she had new life to consider. The man, Julian Harper, followed her discreetly, making a few inquiries with those who had seen her at the bank. His curiosity was piqued. Edmund Blackwood's daughter, here after all these years, dressed as a nun and evidently pregnant. Julian knew the legacy her father had left, the hidden caches of wealth and information that many still sought to find, believing it held power beyond material riches. This was not a simple retrieval of an inheritance. It was the beginning of something far greater. Sister Margaret returned to the convent that night, hoping for solitude. She set the documents and jewels on her modest desk, flipping through them slowly. Among them were letters that her father had written but never sent, and notes scribbled hastily about people and places she barely remembered. One letter, however, caught her eye. It was addressed to her, written in a delicate script that she recognized as her mother's. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you are reading this, then your father's influence has brought you back to this place, even if only for a moment. I know you may resent us, or perhaps the choices we made, but I hope you will understand in time. Your father's actions were not always noble, yet he did love you fiercely, and he made sacrifices that even now, I doubt you could imagine. The life I wanted for you was different from the life he envisioned, but we both wanted you to be safe. If there ever comes a time when you must make a choice, remember the strength of the Blackwood legacy, but remember, too, that strength without mercy is hollow. Tears welled up in Sister Margaret's eyes as she read her mother's words she had waited years to hear. She sat in silence, letting the memories wash over her. Days turned into weeks, and Sister Margaret tried to resume her duties at the convent, though she felt increasingly uneasy. Rumors of her return had begun to circulate, and whispers reached her of people searching for Edmund's hidden treasures, each rumor darker than the last. She realized that she could no longer ignore the world her father had left behind. She would have to face the consequences of Edmund Blackwood's legacy, not only for herself but for the unborn child she now carried. She knew where she had to go next, the house she had left behind years ago, the mansion where she had grown up, the very heart of her father's empire. The Blackwood mansion lay on the outskirts of town, hidden behind towering iron gates and sprawling, overgrown gardens. Once a symbol of grandeur, it now seemed like a relic of another world, its walls carrying the weight of history and shadows. As Sister Margaret stood at the gate, she felt a wave of memories, childhood games, distant laughter, and the deep sense of mystery that had always clung to this place. Pushing the gate open, she walked up the gravel path. The front doors creaked as she opened them, and she was greeted by the musty scent of old wood and memories. She wandered through the main hall, brushing her fingers along dusty surfaces and pausing at portraits of her ancestors. Her father had always spoken of their family's importance, of how they held the town's history in their hands. Yet, to her, these faces were strangers, figures caught in their time, bound by their secrets. Her footsteps echoed as she moved down the hall and reached her father's study, a room she had rarely entered as a child. Inside, the air was thick, almost tangible with the weight of secrets. She approached his desk, a massive oak structure that still bore faint marks from her father's heavy-handed writing. She found letters, a few maps, and documents arranged meticulously, everything her father had always kept away from prying eyes. As she sifted through the papers, a letter caught her attention. It was addressed to a name she knew all too well, Julian Harper, the man she had seen near the bank. Her father had trusted Julian once, but the letter suggested a fractured loyalty, a silent understanding that neither of them would betray the other, but neither would truly trust. She read through the lines, realizing that Julian had once been more than just a trusted associate. He had been a confidant, privy to secrets that no one else knew. The letter hinted at something hidden, a ledger that could expose the truth behind her father's empire. The words were cryptic, but Margaret's instincts told her that this was more than a simple record of finances, it was a weapon. She knew that if Julian was still interested in her family's secrets, he would be seeking this ledger. Margaret closed her eyes, wondering if she should simply walk away. The convent had offered her peace, a life of simplicity away from the complexities of her past. But something inside her, a voice that echoed from her mother's letter, a faint but persistent call, urged her to see this through. She had to confront the truth if she was to move forward, to live without the weight of her father's past on her shoulders. Her child deserved a life free from this burden. Taking the letter, she left the mansion, its looming shadows lingering in her mind as she returned to town. She knew she couldn't do this alone. Julian was the key to unlocking her father's secrets, but he was also a risk. Margaret would need to be cautious. The next day, she arranged to meet Julian at a secluded cafe on the edge of town. When he arrived, she saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He was studying her, trying to read her intentions. They exchanged pleasantries, and then she placed the letter between them on the table. "This was in my father's study," she said, watching his reaction closely. "It mentions a ledger. I believe you know what I'm talking about." Julian's expression hardened, but a trace of admiration flickered in his gaze. "I didn't think you'd ever return to this part of your life, Margaret," he said slowly. "Your father was a complicated man, and not all his actions were admirable. But you're right. There is a ledger, and if it fell into the wrong hands, it could bring down people who still wield power in this town." "People like you?" she asked, her tone steady. He let out a quiet chuckle. "I'm not the only one. There are others who would do anything to keep that ledger hidden. If you choose to pursue this, Margaret, you need to be prepared for the consequences." Margaret took a breath, weighing his words. "I don't want to live under my father's shadow anymore, Julian. This ledger, it might be the only way to break free. To ensure my child never has to carry this burden." Julian regarded her thoughtfully, then nodded. "Very well. I'll help you. But understand, once we start down this path, there's no turning back." The following days were a whirlwind of planning and secrecy. Julian knew of a place where the ledger might be hidden, an abandoned estate on the outskirts of town that had once been a gathering place for her father and his associates. The two of them prepared carefully, aware that their search could attract dangerous attention. Late one evening, they arrived at the estate, its windows broken and walls crumbling, the ruins of a once lavish home now left to decay. With only a flashlight and a map from the letter, they moved through the darkened halls, searching for the hidden room where the ledger was supposedly kept. They finally reached a narrow staircase that led to a basement door concealed behind a bookshelf. Inside the basement, they discovered shelves of old, dusty files. Margaret's hands trembled as she finally found the ledger, its cover worn, the edges frayed from years of handling. She opened it, and the pages revealed a labyrinth of financial transactions, hidden deals, and alliances that stretched far beyond what she had imagined. Her father's influence had extended not only through their town but beyond it, reaching into government circles, criminal syndicates, and businesses that thrived on secrecy. As they pored over the details, Julian glanced at her, his gaze softened by an unspoken understanding. "This is dangerous knowledge, Margaret. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" She met his gaze, her expression resolute. "For my family's sake, for my child's sake, yes. I need to bring an end to this, to ensure it never affects us again." With the ledger in her possession, Margaret began a campaign to dismantle the network her father had built. She contacted old allies who had turned away from her father's empire, piecing together a coalition of those who wanted a fresh start, those who had been hurt by Edmund Blackwood's actions but had lacked the power to oppose him. Her efforts did not go unnoticed. Threats began arriving, anonymous letters left at her doorstep, shadowy figures appearing near the convent. The townspeople whispered, watching as Sister Margaret's quiet return turned into a storm of revelations that would soon shake the foundations of their community. But Margaret did not waver. Julian remained by her side, helping her navigate the dangerous waters she had entered. Together, they uncovered further secrets, pieces of information that exposed corruption among the town's elite, binding her father's associates in a web of lies and fear. The final showdown came one cold autumn night. Margaret confronted the last of her father's former allies, a man who had benefited the most from the Empire's dark legacy. With the evidence in her hands, she offered him a choice: expose the truth or face it in the courts. Realizing he had lost, he signed a confession, and Margaret handed the ledger over to the authorities. As dawn broke over the town, Margaret stood alone in the empty church, feeling the weight lift from her heart. The world her father had created had come to an end, replaced by a new beginning that she would shape for herself and her child. In the weeks following the takedown of her father's empire, Margaret found herself drawn back to the convent. The sisters welcomed her with warmth, though they understood she carried a burden most of them would never fully grasp. In the stillness of the convent, Margaret finally felt some sense of peace. Her role in dismantling her father's network had left the town changed, and though the influence of the Blackwood name lingered, it no longer held the power it once had. People spoke of Edmund Blackwood's daughter with a mix of respect and curiosity, though they left her alone, sensing that she had paid a high price for her actions. For the first time in her life, Margaret could walk the streets without a cloak of secrecy. She moved freely, visiting the markets and speaking with townspeople who once would have looked away or kept their distance. They recognized the courage it had taken for her to stand against her father's legacy, to do what even the authorities had failed to do for years. One evening, as she was returning from the market with a basket of fresh bread and vegetables, she noticed Julian waiting for her at the convent gates. His expression was unreadable, a faint smile flickering across his face. He nodded in her direction, a familiar look of quiet understanding in his eyes. "Margaret," he said, his voice gentle, "there's something you should know. A man came to town yesterday, asking about you. Said he was looking for answers about his family. His name is Oliver Blackwood." Margaret froze, her heart pounding. Oliver had been her half-brother, the son her father had with his first wife before she left. They had been close as children, playing together in the mansion's garden, sharing stories and dreams. But when her mother died and Margaret joined the convent, she had lost touch with him. She had assumed he had left town, seeking a life beyond their family's troubled past. "Where is he now?" she asked, a mix of anticipation and fear in her voice. Julian shrugged, glancing toward the street. "He's staying at the old inn by the river." "But Margaret, he's not the same boy you remember. Just different. Driven. It seems he's been carrying the Blackwood legacy as heavily as you have." Margaret felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had believed she was the last of the Blackwoods, the only one left to carry the burden of her father's choices. Yet now, Oliver's presence reminded her that the past was never truly behind her. The decisions she had made had affected more than just herself. They had changed the course of her family's future as well. Later that evening, Margaret went to the inn. As she entered the dimly lit lobby, she spotted him sitting by the window, gazing out at the dark waters of the river. His hair was longer, his features sharper, but his eyes held the same intensity she remembered. When he saw her, he rose slowly, as if bracing himself for the weight of her presence. "Margaret," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. "I knew you'd come." She approached him, her gaze steady. "I didn't know you were still here, Oliver. I thought you left, that you escaped this place." He smiled faintly, a shadow of bitterness in his expression. "But no matter where I went, the Blackwood name followed me. People whispered, they judged. It's hard to build a life when everyone knows who your father was." They sat together in silence, both of them acutely aware of the distance time had carved between them. She told him about her life at the convent, about her decision to return, and the battles she had fought to free herself from their father's influence. Oliver listened, his expression unreadable, though she could see a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "I came back because I wanted to understand," he said finally. "I wanted to know why you did it, why you risked everything to bring down our father's empire." Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I did it because I couldn't live with the burden anymore. I was tired of carrying the weight of his choices, of living in fear and secrecy. I wanted to start fresh, to create a life that wasn't bound by his mistakes." Oliver nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "And have you found that peace?" Margaret considered his question, her eyes drifting to the window, where the river reflected the moonlight. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know that for the first time, I'm free to try." In the days that followed, Oliver stayed in town, helping Margaret as she rebuilt her life. He was different now, haunted as she was, by the weight of their family's past. But he had a determination that reminded her of their father, a drive to make something of himself that went beyond their shared legacy. Together, they worked to dismantle the last remnants of Edmund Blackwood's influence, contacting the authorities to address lingering issues and ensuring that the town was finally free of the network her father had created. Oliver's presence brought a sense of closure to Margaret. She had faced the shadows of her past, and now, with her half-brother by her side, she could finally begin to move forward. The townspeople noticed the siblings working together, and though they whispered, they recognized the change in Margaret. She was no longer Edmund Blackwood's daughter. She was simply Margaret, a woman who had chosen a path of courage and redemption. Months passed, and the town settled into a new rhythm, the memory of the Blackwood name fading like an old story. Margaret returned to the convent, continuing her work with the sisters and preparing for the arrival of her child. Oliver, too, found a place in the community, offering his skills as a craftsman and quietly rebuilding his life without the shadow of their father's legacy hanging over him. On a crisp spring morning, Margaret gave birth to a healthy baby boy. As she held him in her arms, a sense of peace washed over her, a feeling that all the trials she had endured had led to this moment. She named him Simon, after her mother's family, a name free from the Blackwood legacy, a symbol of a fresh start. Julian visited her at the convent, bringing gifts from the townspeople who had heard of her son's birth. He watched her with the baby, a quiet smile on his face. "You've done it, Margaret," he said softly. "You've finally broken free." She looked up, her eyes bright with tears. "It wasn't just me, Julian. It was everyone who helped me, everyone who believed in a future that didn't have to be shaped by the past." As the sun rose over the convent, Margaret looked out at the town below, feeling a sense of belonging she had never known before. Her father's legacy had once threatened to consume her, but now, she had built a legacy of her own, one of resilience, redemption, and hope. And as she rocked her son to sleep, she whispered a silent promise to him, that he would never have to bear the weight of the Blackwood name, that he would grow up free to choose his own path. For Margaret, this was her victory, a life reclaimed, a future reimagined, and a legacy of silence transformed into one of peace.